Thank you everyone who have joined us till now. You're all welcome to Laravel Nagpur Meetup. As you all know, some of you are, I see some of you are first time joiners. So I'll just give you a brief introduction about Laravel Nagpur. So we are a small community based out of Nagpur city in India. And we have been conducting monthly meetups since February 2019. This, I guess, is our 25th meetup. And earlier we used to do in-person meetups, physical meetups, but since the pandemic began, we have been conducting online meetups. So today we have Sagar Naliyapara with us, and he'll be speaking on how to make your Laravel applications bulletproof, Laravel APIs bulletproof by writing unit tests and feature tests. So a brief, Sagar is a freelance web developer and he spends most of his time in front of his laptop experimenting with PHP and Laravel. Sagar is a Laravel enthusiast and has worked on numerous Laravel projects in the past 6 years. He believes that quality matters more than quantity. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Sagar now. Hey Sagar, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
Sagar. Yes, Sagar.
Okay, great.
It's all yours. Please start. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll share my screen. Give me a second. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen, Sagar. Yes.
Great. Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Laravel Nagpur event. And thanks for joining the meetup. My name is Sagar, and I'm using Laravel framework since 2015, I guess, 16, with version 4.2 when I was started using the Laravel. And since then, I used Laravel for so many projects, and currently I'm working with my clients remotely. And today I'm going to talk about making your APIs bulletproof with testing. So I'll be focusing more on the API testing, and there is a lot of articles about why we need tests and why it is so important, and why actually in every application we should be writing test cases. So I assume you all understand the importance of having tests, and we'll not dig deep into that, but instead I'll focus more on how to set up and write test in application. So let's get started. Before moving further, there is a famous quote from Robert Martin, who is also known as Uncle Bob. Code without test is not clean, no matter how elegant it is, no matter how readable and acceptable it is. But if it has no test, it means it is unclean. So yes, we'll respect this quote at least during this talk. And I hope you all can respect this quote in all of your projects. And we'll try to respect this quote as much as possible. It is really important. So what we are going to cover in this talk, first we'll see all Laravel test introduction and all the basic stuffs, and we'll see some advanced stuff later in the talk, and we'll see how we can use different environment while running tests. Like we all know, there is an env file in our Laravel project, so we'll see how we can have different environment while running test, and how we can use different database as well. So we'll go through that from scratch to learning all the basic things, which is really important as well. Apart from writing tests, like before writing test, we need to do a bit of setup as well. So we'll go through that as well. We'll create our first test in my application, which contains few APIs which are not tested and which might be buggy and might be failing. I'm not sure. We'll see while writing a test, and we'll probably fix those issues. So we'll write test, and for those, we'll make sure it is confidently tested. So we'll be doing kind of live coding, and we'll be writing test cases. Then we'll cover all feature tests. You might call it as API test or HTTP test, but that I'll call it as a feature test. And we'll write feature test for all our CRUD operation and some other APIs as well. And we'll see how we can effectively write tests for each APIs and few interesting stuff as well, along with a lot of refactoring and clean code practices. So we'll cover that. And at the end, if you have got any questions, then we can talk about that, and I'll try to answer your questions. All right. So we'll start with the introduction part. Like in our coding demo as well, like what we'll be doing, we'll have no test, and then at the end we'll be confident enough that these are the tested, and all through the all through the test case. None of them will be from the manual test. We'll be not using Postman. So we'll see. Laravel is built with testing in mind. So in fact, whenever we install our Laravel application, it contains PHP unit XML file. If you have already seen that, it is a root directory, and it supports testing with the PHP unit. So it has already set up for your application. The framework also ships the convenient helper methods that allows to expressively test our application. By default, our application test contains, like, there is a test directory in Laravel application. I don't know if you guys are using it or not, but you should be writing a lot of code there as well. So it contains two directories. One is feature and one is unit, which is by default. And unit tests are tests that focus on very small isolated portion of your test code. And in fact, most unit tests probably focus on single method test within unit test directory, do not boot our Laravel application, and therefore it is unable to access our application's database or framework service. So whenever we write unit test, it won't touch the database or it won't access any framework services. Like, we'll be just giving a class that we want to test this class, and maybe we'll be testing a few methods or any particular methods that will be testing through the unit tests. And I'll show you in the code as well what I mean here. And other than that, about the feature test, like, it should test a larger portion of your code, and including several objects interaction with each other, even a full HTTP request like an endpoint or API call through a JSON endpoint. Generally, most of your tests should be a feature test rather than unit test, except you want to test a particular function or particular portion of your code. This type of test, gives us or provide us the most confidence that our system is functioning as intended. So let's say, like, we should be writing more feature tests than the unit tests. All right, let me show you in the code what I mean here. So by default, we have two directory in this test directory. One is feature and one is unit. So in both directories, they have given the example test. So let's see unit first. Is this visible to all of you, or should I increase the font? Is this visible, or should I increase the font?
It's
Let me
visible,
know if,
Sagar. It's fine.
okay, all right. So yeah, I was talking about the unit test. So I was saying, like, whenever we use the unit test, it doesn't contains it doesn't allow us to interact with the database and also not with the framework service. So why? So it extends the test case class from the PHP unit itself. So there is no role of Laravel framework or database or anything. It directly extends the test case class from the PHP unit, and we just using the simple PHP fundamentals here to test, and we'll be using PHP unit helpers. While in the feature test, it is a bit opposite. It extends the test case, which is located here, and which actually extends the Laravel test case from the vendor file, which contains a lot of helper methods, and it has also this thread creates application. So this application actually boots our framework, and it works like our normal application, and we can send a endpoint, or we can call a HTTP request. So like we have all the access of the framework services and also the database. So that was all about the introduction thing, like what are the things we have by default. Next thing is about test environment. So generally, when we are developing, we are working with the local environment. But in Laravel, when we are running our tests, Laravel automatically sets the configuration environment to testing instead of local, because of the environment variable defined in the PHP unit XML file. So let me show you that. Let's find the PHP unit XML, and there is an app env, and value is set as testing. So generally in our env file, it is set to local, but as we are running a test, we'll be using this, and it will set the environment as testing. So that helps us to differentiate the execution. There are also automatically configures the session and cache to error driver while testing. So it means no session or cache will be persisted while testing. You are free to define other testing environment configuration value as necessary. So we can also define other things that we want to define in the env. While let's say like we want to use different database, then we can just define db database and a database name. Let's say that I will test. So while running a test, it will be using this database instead of that we have defined in the env file that we have defined as Laravel, but like while running test, we can change that on the fly, which is quite good. And yeah, that is really interesting. But let's say like instead of defining everything here, there will also provide another way to do this. So what we can do it here is we can just create another env file named as env.testing. So now everything defined here will be used while we are running our tests. So we can define our database name here, we can define env to testing, and whatever we want to change it here, that we can change while running the test. So it's quite simple. If we have env testing, then Laravel will use this. If we don't have don't have it, then it will be using all the environment values from the year, which is quite default. So let's remove. I don't think we need more than 2-3 things. If you want to change so many things, then we can probably create an environment file. Okay. As I said, Laravel includes the creates application trait in our test case class, and it contains the create application method that bootstrap our Laravel application while running the test. So it's important that we leave this class as it is, this one, because this is going to be used if we are going to use the parallel testing feature. In that case also this will be used, so it's better we do not do so much change in this test, as they also define the same in the documentation as well. So that's all about test environment. Now let's create our first tests. So there are few ways to create a test. Like you can just go here and copy paste this test and name it as whatever you want. But there will also provide let's say a command to create a test. So there are certain commands which, let me show you. We can create a simple feature test using this. So this will create a test in feature directory. Let's see. Yeah, it does. And if you want to create a unit test, then we can just give a flag that we want to create a unit test. If we define it like this, then it will create a unit test. So it's in the unit directory. So it's quite simple. So let's remove that. We don't want yet. We'll create it later. And another thing is, like, how we know that this is a test function and it's not a regular function. So there are two ways to mark it as a test. Either we can add a prefix that this is a test function. As soon as we have this prefix, it will consider it as a test. As soon as we remove the test prefix, it will consider it as a simple function. So this is the first way. Like you can have a prefix like this. And second way is using annotation. So it's just like this. You can add a test, and now it also understands that this is not a regular function and instead it's a test. So it's quite simple. Either you add a prefix. I do prefer that, and you can also add annotation if you want. So now in my application, let me open, let me close all the tabs first, and let me open api.php. We'll see how many APIs we have. So we have a couple of APIs here. We have list API for warehouse, then get API, get detail for warehouse, then create, update, and delete, and same for the bikes orders. So we'll go back to that as well. So let's start with the calling our first API. I don't know if it's working or not, but let's create our first test for warehouse. So PHP artisan make test, and we don't want to create a unit test, but instead we'll create a simple feature test. So they have given the basic test. We don't need these annotations. Let's name it as test warehouse list endpoint. So it's also important that you give a proper name to your test. Like if you just put a test list, let's say, then you might end up with repeated tests like duplicate test list for the bags, list for the orders. But when you are running this in the pipeline, you know that this is the test which is failing, and its problem is in warehouse list endpoint. So it's always better to give an appropriate name to your test. Now let's use our route name, which is defined here, warehouse is .index. And it's a get method, but we know it's a JSON, so we'll use get JSON. Like, let me show you another thing. If I load this thing in a browser, Laravel API testing. Let me save that. So it loads the homepage of Laravel. Like, we want to test this page instead of starting with the API. Let's test this. So we want to test that homepage, and that's the URL. And we don't know if it's working or not. Then let's see if it loads this text or not. So let's copy this text, first line, and let's use here assert C. So what this assert C will do, it will load that page first, and then it will look for this text. If it exists, then it will be passing. If it doesn't exist, then it will be failing. So rather we should test the status first. We don't need this response at all. And let's run this test. So running the test, I mostly run through the PHP Storm, but you can also run from the terminal just by writing PHP artisan test, and you hit enter. It will execute all your tests and it passes. So it means it loads the home page correctly and it can see this text. Now let's change this text. So this text are changed, and now in the home page we shouldn't be able to find this text because I have added some random string here and it shouldn't be there in our home page. So now it should be failing. So let's run this test. There we go. What it says, failed, asserting that this whole page contains this text. So we have wrong text and it cannot see that text. If we just assert the Laravel, then it will work. So it's quite simple. So we can even test our blade, like our pages, either it is loading correctly or not. So those things we can also test here. But our main focus for now is testing the warehouse list. So what we are expecting that it returns 200 and it should also return a JSON. So we'll assert that JSON, and inside that it should contains multiple objects with name. So let me show you the database here. I run migration. Okay, and it should, yeah, here we go, warehouse. So it has ID, name, created it, and updated it. So we expect that each warehouse should contains name. And what's the name? We don't know. So there is no warehouses yet. So what we'll do is we'll create one warehouse. So again, a question like how to create a warehouse in a test. So for that we can use factory. So let's create factory quickly. Factory warehouse factory, and let's write a few things there. Let me go. And in the definition, we want to add a name, and we'll use Faker name. So now we can easily create warehouses as much we want. So we'll It's quite simple. Like if you want to create, let's say 10 warehouses, then this will create 10 warehouses and we can store it in variable. So it's quite simple. This will create 10 warehouses and we should expect at least 10 warehouses. But now we don't know the name of the warehouses and how we can assert those. So let's skip that for now. I'll come back to it later and we can just assert JSON count. Yeah, so how many count? It will be 10 and there is another parameter as well. So remove this, which is key. For now, let's run this test and let's see what it returns. It is saying that failed to assert response count match the expected 10. We are expecting 10 here, but it is saying size is only 1. So let's see what's in the response and why it's failing. So there is an additional data key that we haven't specified. So it just looks here and it's saying, hey, data is the only single length and it's a single array. So if we check our warehouse controller, then in the list, I have used the resource. And if you use resource, then you must be aware that resource includes that additional data key. So we'll have to specify it here that we want to uh, check the count in the data key because our response is coming inside the data key. So let's run this and it works. It is saying your test passes. Great. So now we know that it returns list of the warehouses with data key in it. But now, like again, a question, we want to see the first warehouse name is correct or not and what it returns inside. So there are a couple of options how we can do that. Let's see that. There is a fluent JSON testing. So we can use that like this. We have counted the JSON, but now we'll use the assertable JSON, which is a new feature from Laravel. It released in last couple of months. We can specify this callback, and now using this JSON, we can actually use where all, where all type, where contains, and where type. So there are a couple of way to check the response. So we can use like where ID is 1. Also on top of that, let's minimize this. On top of that, you can also check like where name is something that we don't know it yet, but let's say warehouse is 0 and name, and you have to specify etc to make sure that like if we don't specify etc method at the end of our SSN chain, then this method inform that that there is maybe other attributes present as well in JSON object. So if we specify etc method, then it understands that yeah, there is more than this. If we don't specify, then it will probably assume that we have only those two keys, and if we have more than that, then it will throw an error. So let's run this and let's see if it passes or not. So we'll have to use data.id here, data.star id actually, because there is a multiple, and same thing for this one. And it again fails. So let's see why it is failing. It's Okay, it is saying that in this JSON, there is no data.id. So let's dump this JSON and let's see what it contains. Okay, it contains the data and then 0. So okay, that's good to know. So we'll have to do it like this, that data and first ID is 1 and data and first name is this one. So let's run this and it passes. Now this name that we have got is from this one, but we can probably define name here as well. That name should be it's a test warehouse, and we can copy this name here. And this time let's only create a single warehouse, so it won't be multiple now, and we should expect only single. Let's run this, and yeah, it works. So this is quite simple list endpoint for warehouse, where we can test our JSON effectively and fluently using this assertable JSON. And like we were doing this because it was multiple. If it's a simple, we can just use assert JSON and put it like this, that hey, we have data key, and in that we have multiple array, and simply ID, it should be 1 because it's going to be first records, name, it should be test warehouse. So this also works. Like if you don't want to use this one, then this also works. This will just test our JSON as simple. So you can either pass an array into JSON, or you can pass the assertable JSON callback. It depends upon the case, which is quite good. Now we have tested the list. We'll move further with the there are a couple of endpoints: detail, create, update, and destroy. So I'll go a little fast now. Let's define another test, warehouse, create endpoint. We want to test this as well, and there will be a certain case as well. So we'll see. So let's start. And this is a post method, obvious, because it's a create. So we'll use post JSON method, and we'll define route here, route name, warehouse is dot probably create. Yeah, warehouse is dot store. Let's use that. And we are expecting that status should be 200. We don't want to assert ever that our API returns 500. It should be 200. So let's see. In this one, we also need to pass a data that, hey, I want to create a warehouse with name as new warehouse. So we can pass a data in the second argument of post JSON. First argument is the URL. So you can generate a URL using route method and the name inside. And second parameter is just passing a data. So we pass the name, and then we are expecting, hey, this should return 200. And on top of that, what it returns? It should return the warehouse itself. So yeah, it's this one. And if it returns warehouse, then it should be a JSON. So what it will be like assert JSON and name in it. It should be same as what we have specified in the data. If we specify different, then it should throw an error. So let's run this. And it fails. It's saying that it returns 201. So it's interesting thing to know that when we create any record, actually it returns 201 instead of 200. 201 is also success code, but because we have just created this warehouse, it adds recently created code into it, 201. So we should be asserting 201 here. And let's now run this test, and it passes. So it returns the warehouse with correct name. And but now we don't know if it has created in the database or not. We are expecting that when we hit this endpoint, it should return warehouse, but it should also create entry in the database. So for now, we don't know it has created or not, but we should test that. And we can just simply test it using this where data where assert database has, and in that we can specify table name, which is warehouse is, and it should contain name, which is new warehouse. So let's see if it passes. If we say warehouse one, then it should fail. So actually this actually checks in our database whether we have any warehouse with this name or not. And also there are a couple of ways to test this. We can either do it something like this, before count, where we can just store warehouse count before creating one, and we can assert here after count. So what will assert equals before count plus 1. It should be incremented by 1, and from where it should fetch is from the database. So this is another way to check if it has created a new record in database or not. It will be based on count, and this is more deep, like with the name also. And even one more thing, instead of this, we can store this response, for example, and response should also return ID, like it should also return warehouse itself. So it should return ID. So we can assert with the ID also, response, JSON, and just ID. Let's see, it works. If we specify any other ID here, then it will fail. Yeah, it is saying that we are failed to assert that this attribute matches in the database because we have specified wrong ID, while in the database it has one. So we can just use the what we have got from the response. So it's quite simple. We can check in the database, you can check the response, and there are so many methods already available in Laravel to test this. But we are missing one thing here, which is testing a validation. We have passed proper data, that's why it's working, but we don't know if user just passes empty string or null or something like that. So in that case, we'll have to create another endpoint, another test case, which will check, which would suggest that test, verify, create endpoint validations. So now, what to test in validation? We can test if we pass empty string. First of all, let's check the validations. So validation is required minimum 2. It should be string and it should be unique in warehouses. So we'll try to cover all of these rules in this test. So first of all, if we pass empty string, then we know it should return 422. 422 is the validation exception code, and we can assert here that it has assert JSON validation errors is a helper name, and in that we can specify that it has error, JSON validation error in name, and this should go away. This one also, and let's run this test. And it is saying that it is 400 instead of 422. Why it is? So let's dump that. Okay, it says it returns the error, but it isn't returning error as we want. We want it as Laravel format, but it is doing some another thing. So we will not use this Mac and validate the thing. We'll just use, let's just copy this and I'll put this in here. So this is our validation, and what we'll do, we'll just validate these rules against the request inputs. And if it fails, it will automatically throws the validation. So let's run it again. Great. So it has returns the validations errors as per the Laravel format, and it contains the field name. Now, if we pass a single character, then it also failing because saying that it should be at least 2 characters. And if we pass 2 characters, then it should fail because now it is not returning 422, it is returning 201. But now again, like we want to test with the empty string, we want to test with the single character. So we don't want to, copy paste these whole test, and one test is for single character, let's say, and one test is for empty string. It's quite weird, right? This is really frustrating, and for each and every case, like just assume like how many tests we'll have. So for that, PHP unit introduced the data provider. How you can use that? You can just say that you can just ask this function that this is data provider test, and we can specify a function name, which should be create validations. So how we can use these data providers? I'm explaining it to you. We have defined data provider, and we have told this test that we are going to use data provider here. You can just use this annotation, and that's it. So now with this name, you'll have to create a public function below it. So let's create that, and it should return all the possibilities. So I'll explain you in a bit how it works. First, let's write the test. Let's see, we want a data. So it will be a name. We want a name, dynamic name. First, previously it was like empty string and single character, but now it will be dynamic. So we'll take whatever is passed here. And here we'll be taking probably code, like it should return 201 or 422. And we'll probably remove this for now. So we'll depending on the test. So if we pass empty string, then code should be 422. If we pass single string, then again code should be 422. But if we pass 2 characters, then it should return 201. If we pass, let's say, so many characters, it should also return 201. And let's see what else we want to cover. Yeah, we want this unique thing. Let's put this max as well. Let's say max 255. Yeah, we want this unique thing. So what we'll do, we'll create one warehouse here, warehouse factory, create name, let's say test. So we already have one warehouse with this test. And if we pass test as again, then it should also return 422, not 201. And if we pass, so many string, like more than 255, in that case also it should return 422 instead of 201. So let's see how we can repeat the string. There must be a useful function that we can use. Yeah, there we go. we can keep A and it should be 256. If it's 256, then it should return 422. But if it's 255, then it returns 201. So we have covered all the case, and this is what data provider provides. Like you can have dynamic arguments here, and you can specify all your inputs and output here. That way, you don't have to repeat your same test multiple times. Otherwise, to cover all these things, we might have to create 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tests. But now it's only one test and using data providers. So let's run this test. Everything works except this fifth one. So fifth one is, it starts from the 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This doesn't work, and this is saying 500. So there we go. If someone entered 256 characters, then we'll be getting 500. So let's see why it's throwing 500. And let's click here. So too long for name, but I was changing it here. Instead, I should have been changed the validation here. And let's put this max 255. And this can happen with us in the live project as well. Like we are changing somewhere else and we assume that it should be working fine now, and we are not testing it and we are pushing it to production, and then we are seeing so many errors. So now everything works fine, all passes. If we say that 256 should return 201, then it should again fail. So it's 422. So we have learned so many things here. Like the new thing is database, data provider, also how to check against database, and factory as well. If you are not using factory, then you should be using factory as well. And also how we can assert the field, like either this field is in the validation error or not, right? So we can check that here as well, just by using a condition. If it's 422, then we want to check this. If it's not, I don't know this is gonna work or not. Let's try it. It's failing. It is saying you can't provide empty. So yeah, if you want to do this conditional thing, then it's quite easy to use this response. And so we have checked code already, and here you can just put if code is equal to 422, then we can again change that with the response. So it all quite works. If you don't want to put conditional, then you can simply chain it here. But if you want to do something like this, then you can use it if condition and use this response and chain it further here. So let's run it now. It works great. We have covered create. Now let's also cover detail. So let's write one more test, and this will be the last one, I guess, because we are running out of time. So get detail warehouse endpoint. It's a simple test. So let's just use get JSON because it's a get method. Use route warehouses dot show, and what we are expecting assert status 200 again, our favorite code. And before that, like we'll also have to specify which warehouse we want to pass it here. So we'll have to specify an ID, I guess. Yeah. And let me find that show method here as well. Yeah. So this is show method, this one, which checks if warehouse exists, then it returns the warehouse. Otherwise, it just returns the JSON error that warehouse is not found. So let's check that if it's working or not. So let's pass ID. So we'll have to create new warehouse factory create. We have got warehouse here, and it's simply warehouse ID. And let's see if it returns 200 or not. It doesn't. It's saying that route soap method missing with parameters. So instead of data, we'll have to pass it in the URL because this route parameter needs to be in the route method itself, and it passes. And let's see what it returns. Great. It returns ID, name, and timestamp. So it works well. But what if we pass different ID which is not exist? So let's see. It returns an error. But another thing to refactor here, in the controller, there is a lot of mess. Like this ID is not actually round binded. So what we can simply use, we can specify the model name here, and it is now binded already. And let's change this to warehouse. If we change this here, then we'll also have to change this parameter here as well. So let's change this. Great, we have warehouse. We don't want to use that find, and if it doesn't found, then now Laravel will manage that. So we'll simply return warehouse directly. Let's run. Finger crossed. Okay, missing parameter because we have changed it to warehouse. Great. Great, it works. If we just pass the invalid, then also it should work, and it should throw 404 by default because Laravel doesn't found the warehouse here due to route model binding, and it immediately throws the error. Great. So we have covered so many things, and I wanted to share last two things. We have covered like calling API, available assertions, then data providers as well, debug, how to debug. We can simply use the debug function, debug helper method from Laravel. The last two things that I want to cover is setting up data for test and code coverage. So yeah, sometimes like, if you see here in each test, I have created a warehouse in each test. If you see this one, here I have created warehouse. In this one, I haven't, but in this one also, and also in this one. So isn't it good if we just create a warehouse in one of the methods which gets called each time? So yes, there is one method from Laravel which actually gets called each time whenever we run our tests. It's set up and it returns void, and we'll have to call parent setup as well. So if you want to create a warehouse each time, then you can simply add it here. Let's name it as test in each one, and we can remove it from here. Great. We can remove it from here as well as also from the here. So, and we can add a class parameter, which is warehouse this, and let's add into the class property. So now we should be able to use this here, warehouse. Great. So this setup method gets called each time when you run or execute any of your tests. So if we execute this test, oops, it's saying unknown formatter. Where is that? In the factory? I don't know. Let's create without the name. Hmm. I haven't seen this error before. So let's search quickly if you can find the issue. Okay. So factory can be used here, but like somehow it 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 has issue with this test cases trait. That's why it isn't running. But main purpose of this setup method that you can set up your data here as well. And sometimes even on top of that, you want to set up your data at high level, not at particular class. And like, let's say you want to run a particular seeder, or you want to run all the seeders before running each test. So in that case, you can use these two properties from the refresh database trait. So how we can use that? If we put it seed as true, then before executing each test, it will execute our all the seeders. So it will execute database seeder, and it should contains all the class there. So it will execute each and every seeder. But sometimes, it big application, we set up all our test data in one of the seeder, let's say test seeder, and we put all the data there that, before running each test, it should run this seeder and it should set up all the data there. So in that case, we can use this property and we can just define a seeder class. So which is also quite useful. Great. Last thing is about the code coverage. So we have written these many tests, and let me revert back a few things. Great. We have written a few tests here, but we don't know how much code it covers. So if you see option here, there is third option, run this test with coverage. So if I hit this, then it will execute and it will generate the code coverage. So now if we see our controller, see in each line it has green. It means it has been executed. Here it's red. So it means we haven't tested update endpoint yet. We haven't tested destroy endpoint yet. And we have not tested this function as well. So it's quite simple. You just need to run test with coverage and it will generate coverage for you. But before that, you will have to install Xdebug and do some setup. I'll share a link in chat which you can follow to set up that. How to generate code coverage in PHP Storm using PHP unit and Xdebug. So let me send those. Great. Yeah, there is another thing as well. It's inbuilt in the editor. But what if we want to see our code coverage not in the editor but in the browser? So we can use this command as well. Vendor bean PHP unit code coverage HTML, and we want this code coverage to be in this directory. So let's run that. Okay, it has run 12 tests with 24 SSN, and it has created code coverage for us in storage directory, test, and coverage, and index.html. So let's open this in browser. All right, let me share this with you all. So it gives us a report here as well, like in the HTTP file, the code coverage is almost 20% in controllers. In warehouse, code coverage is 50%. In bike controller, it is 0. We haven't tested that. In order controller, it is 0. And if you open this warehouse controller, then it says that these are the things already tested. And also it says that it's tested with this test. If it's tested with multiple tests, then it will display multiple tests here. And these aren't tested. So it's quite useful, right? All right, I think we are good to go. I have covered almost all the things that I wanted to say. Now it's your time. I have already pushed this repository in my GitHub, so you can go there, and if you want to see anything there, I'll also commit this thing as well, so you can also check it out. You can reach out to my email or Twitter or LinkedIn, wherever you want. If you have got any question, you can ask me.
Thanks, Sagar. Thanks a lot. So now if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. You can directly unmute and ask the questions if you want to. No problems.
No questions?
So Sagar, actually, I have one question. So
Yes, sure.
the tests that you showed today, they were all for testing APIs, right?
Yeah.
If I have a normal Laravel application wherein the views are also rendered inside the application itself, then how should I go about writing tests in that case?
Well, if you are just asking me about the blade files, then as in the initial point I said, you can also test the text in the browser. So while we were testing that home page, in that home page we have tested that text, that whether this page contains this text or not. So kind of simple thing you can test, like is this page loads correctly or not. But if you want to, let's say, test a form, that when we have a form and you write something in the form in each input and you click on the button, so for those we can use Laravel Dusk, which is a browser test, and it actually opens our browser automatically whenever we run this test, and it executes all our tests there.
Okay. And what if I want to, if I have a normal Laravel application, not an API, and if I want to test my controllers, let's say, or models, for instance, so how should I go about testing those things?
Yeah, for models, like if it's totally independent with the database and you want to test a function, let's say, or you want to test a class besides forgetting everything about the framework services and the database connection, then you can simply use unit test. And sometimes you might want to use a mock. You might have to mock a little bit. Let's say we are testing a particular controller, and in that controller we are calling a payment gateway. So actually, yeah, it's quite obvious that we when we run the test, it shouldn't get called and it shouldn't execute anything. So in that case, we'll have to mock that payment gateway class, and that will just you know, it will behave like what we are specifying in the mock, and it won't call any external URL or any external library.
Okay. Okay, that was all from my side. So anyone else have any questions? We'll just wait for a few more moments. Anyone?
Yeah, if you have any feedback, any suggestion, any questions, everything welcome. At least I expect feedback from your guys. Like how
Okay,
was the
then I think that is it, Sagar. Uh, thanks a lot, Sagar, for spending
Great.
time with us and speaking on the topic. It was really informative, and I hope everyone has learned something new today.
Yeah. Actually, I haven't shared that link that I was saying during the topic, how to generate and view code coverage in PHP Storm. So I'll just share with everyone.
Okay. Yeah, Sagar has shared the link in the chat box, so feel free to copy the link and save it for later.
Yeah.
Okay, then everyone, thanks a lot for joining, and I hope that I'll see you all again next month in our next meetup with a new speaker. Thank you. Have a good night and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Yo, bye.